What if I told you that there is a camera with every feature and more that people have been asking for in an upgraded Sony FX3, and that camera is less expensive than the FX3, and it is made by Sony, it's not some unknown brand that you're totally unfamiliar with, and it was released a year and a half ago. And that would be this camera right here, the Sony Z or Z200. Now, obviously this does not look quite like an FX3, and Sony calls it a camcorder, but this camcorder, so many different features that I think it's a little bit ridiculous. And just want to be clear, this is not a sponsored video. This is purely my own curiosity driving this. Sony loaned me this camcorder for a little over a month, and I'm at the end of that period, so I have to send it back soon. And I don't want to because I really love it. I asked Sony if I could borrow a modern camcorder, a 4K camcorder, and they said, literally no one has ever asked to borrow a camcorder. But to be clear, there are two major things that do separate this from something like an FX3, and that is the sensor size and the lens. So as a camcorder, this has a smaller sensor, has a 1-inch 4K sensor versus like a full frame 35mm sensor. And it has a non-interchangeable lens. So the lens that's on here is the one that's permanently on here, just like you probably experienced with, every camcorder you've ever used. But the thing is, a lot of people, when they think about camcorders, they think about something that looks like this, while the Z200 is much more akin to something that looks like this. Now, this is a 23-year-old standard definition. This camera's awesome. What is this? This is a Sony DS280. This thing is awesome. But this is a professional, broadcast camcorder from 2003, and resolution, image quality aside, the modern Sony camcorder is very much a compact version of this. Now, as I just mentioned, this camcorder was released in late 2024, so it's a newer camera, way newer than the FX3 that I'm filming on right now, but it's not, a brand new camera that just came out or anything. And this is where it gets interesting. It has an MSRP currently of $4,600, which is not cheap. That is a very expensive camera. But for reference, this camera right here is the Sony FX3, and I'm also using my Sony 24mm f1.4 lens. I bought both of these in 2021, and at that time the FX3 was $3,800 and the lens was $1,300. So that makes this a $5,200 setup. $5,200, $4,600. Because even though the FX3 camera itself was cheaper than this camera, it doesn't come with a lens. But wait, there's more. Inflation is a thing and politics are weird, so now for some reason cameras are more expensive. The Sony FX3 currently, at the time I'm filming this, has an MSRP of $4,300. So it went up $500. And the lens that I'm filming on has an MSRP of $1,600. So that means the setup that I spent $5,200 on is now closer to $6,000, which now, that means it's $1,400 more expensive than this camera. So ultimately, this is kind of just an exploration of my own curiosity, like I mentioned before. But if you're looking at a camera and you're thinking of the FX3, I wouldn't recommend a camera like this for, commercial narrative filmmaking, or for somebody who does have a nice extensive lens collection and you really want, to change out prime lenses, you need fast lenses. But if you're doing work that needs versatility, you kind of just need a very extremely video-centric workflow, or you're doing documentary stuff, journalism stuff, interviews, corporate commercial type stuff, this camera could be a much smarter choice than trying to rig out mirrorless cameras. So while this does not have the full frame sensor of the FX3, it does have a 1-inch 4K sensor, and it is capable of going all the way up to 4K 120. I have filmed and included it in videos I've made since I've had this camera with me, 4K 120 clips mixed in with the FX3. In fact, every video I've made for the past 5 weeks, maybe 6 weeks at this point, has included footage from this camcorder in it, mixed in with my FX3 or say A7S III, and no one has said anything because it looks great. And it is a Sony camera, so the colors and everything mix in very well with my Sony cameras. I don't want to go into a full tech spec breakdown, but I do kind of want to cover some of the main points of this camera. So what I've been using it for is a secondary or sometimes even tertiary camera. And like I said, it would have a permanent place in my workflow if I could keep this camera, or if I just had an extra $4,600 lying around. So it often fills a similar role as this camera right here, which is my Obsbot Tail 2, and you can see it sitting right here. This is a PTZ camera with a really nice zoom. And what's nice about PTZ is I can sit here and I can just control it, or I can select the camcorder here and now the PTZ camera will track it without me having to do anything. But where this has come into play is when I have it set up as that camera, the lens on here, it's not a fixed aperture. This is an f2.8 to f4.5 variable lens. So when it's at its widest, you can go down to 2.8. And then when you zoom in its furthest, it goes up to f4.5. But with how far the lens can zoom in, you can still get some pretty insane background separation and background blur. The lens itself is a 7mm to 154mm lens, which on a full frame equivalent, so if I were to have an equivalent lens on this camera, my FX3, it would be a 24mm to 480mm lens. And that is why this has been incredibly nice to have in my workflow. To have 24mm, that's this right here. So at its widest, the same as this camera, all the way to 480mm. Basically what that means is I can set that up, and much like I'm using the OBSBot over here, I can then zoom in on details. So when I have stuff on the desk, things that I'm showing, not only can I just zoom in, but being able to zoom in that far kind of gives me what is almost macro capabilities. Kind of in the same way that I can set up a PTZ camera and know that it's going to be able to pan, tilt, and zoom and capture whatever I need. I can set up this camera and know that from wide to extremely tight, it's going to be able to capture any detail that I need. And just to give you an idea of how this camera works in a studio environment, this is my Sony FX3 with my 24mm f1.4 lens, and this is the Z200 camcorder with its built-in lens. It's next to the FX3, but it's not framed exactly the same, so framing aside, if we look at image quality and color, they are both recording at 4K, but this is at f3.1 right now to kind of get the framing that's as wide as I could open the aperture versus f1.4. And not only is that a difference in aperture, but that's also a difference in sensor size. So when I'm at a wide shot like this, I'm never really going to be able to get the same level of background blur that I can get on a camera like the FX3 with a prime lens, but you just work within the limitations of the tool that you're using. If I were to push this camera further back and then zoom in on a subject, now we have a lot more background separation. And right now, this is just the default picture profile straight out of the camera. But if I add a little bit of adjustments, now this looks much more similar to my FX3 over here. But hopefully you can extrapolate that to other things, like I mentioned, interviews, journalistic stuff, documentary, things where you don't necessarily need to change out a whole bunch of lenses, but you need reliable video performance. So let's go through some of the features here. We'll start with the less interesting side over here because there's less to look at. We have some remote connections. We have time code in and out, so you can send and receive time code. You have a zoom rocker. You have menu and focus magnification. We have a built-in fan, of which I am a fan. Basically, you never have to worry about overheating with a camera like this. You have your HDMI output. You have USB. You have SDI. You have time code in and out. You have Ethernet. You also then over here have your memory cards, which are dual SD-CF Express, basically exactly the same as what's on the FX3, the A7S III, and my A7 IV. And the weird thing about the power, so this battery has been really good overall, the battery life on this camera, but something super strange is, at least the way I've been using it, I can't get the battery to charge when the camera is plugged in. So a lot of times on other cameras, you have the battery inside, you plug the camera in, and then the battery will charge and the camera will receive power. In this case, the camera will receive power, but the battery won't charge. The only way to charge the battery is to connect it to its external charger, which fortunately is a really fast charger, but to me that's super strange. And it took me a while. I was like leaving this plugged in overnight thinking I'd have a fully charged battery in the morning, and I did not. And so that's weird. That's weird. It's probably my least favorite thing about the camera. If we look at the top of the camera, just like you would hope from a camcorder, you have controls up here. You got zoom, record, custom buttons. You even have playback control options. You have a hot shoe right here. So just like with other Sony cameras, I can plug in a microphone directly to this that uses a hot shoe. So something like the Sony ECM series microphones, or like the DJI Mic Mini, DJI Mic 3, those kinds of things can just go right here if they have a Sony adapter. One of my favorite things about the Sony FX3 are its audio controls, and this camera has pretty much the exact same thing built in. So we have two full-size XLR connectors here. We have a 3.5mm input. We even have a holder if you want to attach a shotgun microphone. But unlike the FX3, we have our little phantom power options here. But where are the other options. That brings me to the most exciting side of the camera. We have our audio controls. We have our dials, we have our auto manual adjustments, and then I can also open this up for a little more control if I need it, which is very nice. But we also have all of these fun buttons right here. We have an auto manual switch. So if I just want to go from auto to manual, I don't have to dig in sort of an amorphous button. There's just a physical switch for that. Same with the power button, very similar to the FX3, basically the same power button. We've got our menu controls here with a dial button to go through the menus. We've got night shot, because just like an old school Sony camcorder from the late 90s, early 2000s, this has night vision, you can see in the dark. We've got display and audio settings. We've also, any of these buttons that are numbered can be custom buttons, just like you might expect from other Sony cameras. We have a network option, which I'm going to talk about more in a second. And then we also have S and Q. So if you want to go into those high frame rates, 4K 120, you can just push a button right there and you're good to go. Here we've got exposure controls, we've got ISO, white balance, shutter speed. You can do a preset or an A and B, and we also have low, medium, and high gain settings. So if you need to essentially change your ISO quickly or have that same effect of increasing your exposure quickly, instead of having to dive into menu, you can just go low, medium, and high. So for example, if the lens is zoomed all the way out and your aperture is at f2.8, you can have that on low. If suddenly you need to zoom in really far and it goes up to f4.5 and now your image is looking a little bit dark, you can just flip this little switch to medium or high and it's going to boost the exposure of the image without you needing to change any other settings. And then we have these options right here. And when I say that this camera has everything and more that people have been asking in a potential FX3 upgrade, this is a big one. Not only do you have a built-in 2 to 7 stop ND filter, but it is a variable ND filter. So you can fine tune it anywhere between 2 and 7 stops. And even though it's not an interchangeable lens, you do essentially have a G Master lens, a G Master quality lens on this camera right here. And you have a physical focus control and a physical zoom control. And then you also have the custom button, just like you do on other G Master lenses, which you can assign to be whatever you want. And you have your manual auto switch right there. We've also got a built-in color viewfinder. You probably would expect that. And we have this really cool display right here, which has, look at that little sunshade that pops up. That is pretty nifty. But if you don't need that, because it's kind of in the way or you just don't need it, this just slides right off. And then you have a regular LCD display with a few physical controls, including a customizable button on the side right here. So let's go through the menus real quick to give you a better idea of some of the features this camera has to offer. If I press the menu button one time, it takes me into kind of this quick setting. But if I hold the menu button down, then I go into the full menu setting, which looks a lot more like you would kind of expect from Sony cameras, especially more of like the Sony Cinema type cameras. So in our basic project settings, this is where we can do frame rates, shooting mode, we can do log, we can do Rec 709, basically everything you expect from a cinema camera like the FX3. We have a monitoring option, so if you're sending HDMI out, you can choose if you want that to be, and this is all touchscreen too, by the way, so you can choose if you want to send, HD or full-on 4K over 1080, which is, kind of awesome. We have an option to go through all of our assignable buttons. So every button on the side of the camera has a number next to it. This is what you can assign it to, very similar to other Sony mirrorless cameras. We have a very detailed battery option. So you can see this battery is actually pretty new despite being made back in 2024. It's only gone through 9 charge cycles. Media, this is where you can see what cards you have. You can format the cards from here. And then we also have network. So a lot of Sony cameras have pretty advanced networking options that you might not be totally aware of. But this camera, if you want to connect it to a network, whether that's part of a production setup or you want to use this to kind of essentially stream directly somewhere, you can do that in a number of ways. As you can see, there's USB, wired LAN, wireless LAN, and Bluetooth. You have a lot of networking options. Networking is so far beyond my wheelhouse that I'm not even going to begin to try to explain it. But if you're someone who needs that, you know you need it. This camera has a lot of it, and I just want you to be aware that that's an option. And that goes even further with these stream settings here, so you can set this to stream wherever you need it to, whether that's an internal server or something, or an external platform. And you also have file transfer options, so again, more of those network capabilities there. We can go into our camera settings, and this is where we can, through the screen, we can change white balance, we can change ISO, exposure, all those things that you can do with physical controls, you can also do through the menus here. We have pretty advanced audio settings, so 4-channel audio, we can mix, match, combine, do whatever we need to do all right here. And then we go back to our project settings. We've gone kind of around the world on the menu. But now if I switch over to a recording that I'm doing on here, I have, I am zoomed out to 24 millimeters, but if I want to zoom all the way in, there we go. high. It's very confusing to think of which camera to look at with this right here. So we have some pretty nice zoom. We can change the zoom speed if we want to, but also I wanted to show you the ND options. So right now I don't have any ND filters on, but I can add ND, and there you see it go. So now we have presets. You know, we have 1/4, 1/16, 1/64, but we also have the option on the side here to flip this ND switch, and then we can use auto ND or variable ND. So once I have that flipped over, now I can turn the ND dial, and you can sort of see it's changing smoothly, very gradually. It's not going on those heavy stops where you literally see the filter move. Now we are changing it very gradually. A built-in ND filter is something that people have wanted on the FX3 for a very long time. But a big controversy with mirrorless cameras is the limitations of you kind of either choose built-in ND or image stabilization because physically there's not necessarily enough room to fit both of those things into the camera. Well, guess what? You have built-in variable ND and built-in image stabilization right here. Again, everything and more that people have been asking for in an upgraded FX3. And that's really what I was getting at when I was saying that this is called a camcorder, but you might need to change your perception of what you think a camcorder is. Because I just gave you that feature tour. Now, look at this. If we start focusing on my old Sony broadcast camcorder, you're gonna notice a lot of similarities. Look at all of these physical controls. We have a physical gain control with high, medium, and low. We have output bars, which is pretty cool. We have white balance with a preset and white balance A or B. We have menu navigation. We don't have a smooth variable automatic ND filter like we do here, but we do have an ND filter here that I can just turn this knob and it's gonna physically move and change the ND filter. And I can also turn that off entirely. We also then have some different controls hidden here for manual and auto control. And just like on the Z200, we have a secret panel that I can open up, and there's a whole bunch more options. There's a whole bunch more manual controls, including our audio options that have the exact same settings as the Z200 and the FX3. Now the lens on this camera really is something special in terms of image quality, but it does not have any autofocus, so it's a fully manual controlled lens, but it does have power zoom or manual zoom if you want it. But even though this is technically an interchangeable lens camera, you can take off this lens and switch it with other ones. Nobody ever switches lenses with these cameras. The lenses are very, very expensive, especially when they're bought new. This was a $20,000 camera when it was brand new. Very rarely are the lenses switched out. So the lens you get with it, it's a super versatile lens, just like this, that goes super wide and then super zoomed in, kind of covers all the bases. It's what you need to take this camera into a variety of situations and know that it's gonna do everything you need it to do. But if you look at the layout of these two cameras and the types of physical controls that are included, you can kind of see that the Z200 camcorder is much more closely related to something like this giant broadcast camera than, you know, the home movie camcorder that you might think of. But as great as this camcorder is, if I press the eject button, this is your reminder that this is a 480p standard definition camera that records to a tape, a single tape, versus dual memory card 4K 120. What is kind of cool about this though is it can take these giant DV cam tapes, or you can also just fit a regular mini DV cassette right in here. So without an adapter or anything, this camera works with two types of tapes, which is kind of similar to how this camera, the FX3, can use two kinds of memory cards. They're more similar than I thought. Also, this is just a black and white viewfinder, which I'm confused by because they had color viewfinders in 2003. I don't know why this is black and white, but it is. This is full color on both. Now what I do want to emphasize here is as much as I'm talking up this camcorder, as much as I like it, and I don't want to send it back, so sorry if it gets lost in the mail, I'm not saying why would anybody buy an FX3. I'm using my FX3 and I'm not using this camera to film this video. But I have been using this, like I said, as a secondary or tertiary camera in every video I've made since I've had access to it. And for me, it's a great fit in my workflow that way. But looking at the capabilities, it's easy to kind of get stuck in the world of what is everyone else using for things. Mirrorless cameras make a lot of sense. They're great for a ton of different reasons. But the fact that when I asked to borrow a camcorder, Sony said nobody had ever asked to borrow one, and how feature-packed and awesome this thing is, it really makes me think that these are probably a bit underrated and probably a bit overlooked. And depending on your workflow, depending on your needs and your budget, it could be worth checking out something like this instead of a traditional mirrorless setup, especially for those really versatile run and gun, set it and forget it situations where you don't need to be changing lenses and gear all day. You just need one camera to rule them all and do a little bit of everything with it. I think it's definitely worth re-examining preconceived notions of what you might think a camcorder should be.